They expected humanity to yield then, the sky filled with warships. The alarm hit before I even opened my eyes. Not a soft chime, not a gentle wake-up call, but the kind of sound that means something has already gone wrong, and you are already behind. I rolled out of my bunk on the Meridian, and my boots hit the deck before my brain caught up with my body. 3 seconds later, I was in the corridor. 10 seconds later, I was on the bridge. My name is Kate Sullivan. I am a tactical officer for the Terran Defense Fleet, and on that morning, the sky above Earth was no longer empty. 12 massive ships had appeared in high orbit, arranged in a slow, deliberate formation, like predators who already know they have won. They had not fired a single shot. They did not need to. Their size alone was a message. Each one of those ships could have swallowed 3 of ours, without noticing the weight. I slid into my station and pulled up the sensor feed. My hands were steady, but my chest was tight. Commander Ryan Cole was already standing at the center console, arms folded, eyes locked on the main display. He did not turn when I approached. "They are not moving," he said. "Not advancing, not retreating, just watching." "That is worse," I said. He nodded once. I agreed with him, though neither of us said it out loud. Within the hour, a transmission arrived. It was translated instantly into every major human language, spoken in a smooth, calm, almost gentle tone, the kind of voice you would expect from someone offering you tea, not someone deciding the fate of your entire species. The message was simple. Humanity was to submit to the authority of the Cothan Compact. We were to accept status as a client world. Our resources, our industries, and our military would fall under their command structure. In exchange, we would be permitted to continue living on our own planet, under their supervision, as one of many worlds that had accepted this arrangement before us. We were given 72 hours to respond. I remember staring at the countdown timer that appeared on every screen across the ship, ticking downward in perfect, patient numbers. There was no anger in that message, no threat, just quiet, absolute certainty that we would say yes, because every other species before us had said yes. That certainty was the most unsettling part. I turned to Ryan. "Do we know anything about them? Anything real?" He tapped his console and a file opened. Thin, mostly redacted, stamped with clearance levels I did not usually have access to. "The Cothan Compact," he said, "is a coalition of species spread across a wide region of space. 12 known members. All of them joined the same way. First contact, then an ultimatum, then submission within a week. Sometimes less." "A week," I repeated. "Some faster," he said. "There is no recorded case of a species refusing." I felt my stomach turn, not because I believed we were weak. I did not believe that. I felt it because I understood, for the first time, exactly how confident they must be. They were not bluffing. They were not nervous. They had done this so many times that it had become a formality to them, a script they read out of habit. General Daniel Wright called an emergency session with Senior Fleet Command less than 2 hours after the ultimatum arrived. I was ordered to attend not because of my rank, but because I had spent the last 3 years working on classified defense projects that very few people outside that room even knew existed. The room was quiet when I walked in. Grace Whitfield, our lead diplomatic officer, was already there, her expression unreadable. A woman who had spent her whole career learning how to hide exactly what she was thinking. General Wright stood at the head of the table, a solid, steady presence, the kind of man who did not raise his voice because he never needed to. "They are expecting silence and fear," he said. "They are expecting confusion, arguments, division. That is how it always goes for them." "So we give them something else," Grace said. "We give them nothing," Wright replied. "For now, no answer, no panic, no visible reaction at all." I sat quietly, listening, understanding exactly what he meant, because I already knew what was happening far away from that room, hidden behind the moon, buried beneath ice, tucked into shadows that no alien sensor sweep had ever detected. For years, long before any of this began, our governments had prepared for exactly this kind of moment, not because we expected the Cothan specifically, but because it was only logical that eventually, Somewhere out there, we would meet someone bigger than us, someone older, someone used to being obeyed. I had been part of that preparation. My work was never public. My name was never in any official report that anyone outside a small circle would ever read. I helped test drive systems that should not have been possible with our current understanding of physics. Engines built from decades of theory nobody thought we would need so urgently. I stood in cold, silent hangars and watched ships get built that the public had no idea existed. I was not the only one. Thousands of people across the world had spent years of their lives building something we hoped we would never have to use. Now it seemed we would. General Wright continued speaking, his voice calm and even. We used 69 of our 72 hours preparing. We used the last 3 to answer. Answer how? Someone asked from across the table. Wright looked around the room slowly before he spoke again. Not with words. Nobody argued with him. Nobody dared. I left that meeting with my heart pounding harder than it had during the actual alarm that morning. Not because I was afraid of losing. I was afraid of what it would cost us to win. I had seen the readiness reports. I had seen the numbers. I knew that whatever happened next would not be simple, and it would not be painless. Back on the Meridian, Ryan met me at the airlock the moment I stepped through. "Well," he said, arms crossed. "What did command say?" "Nothing official," I said, "which means everything unofficial is already happening." He studied my face for a long moment. "You look like someone who just found out the size of a problem they already knew existed." "That is exactly what happened," I said. Over the following hours, ship systems across dozens of vessels I was authorized to monitor came alive one by one, quietly, without any outward change visible from orbit. Reserve crews reported to duty stations without public announcement. Communication channels shifted to protocols I had only ever practiced in simulations. Every second of that stillness above Earth was matched by motion far below and far beyond what the Kothan fleet could see. I sat at my station, watching their 12 ships hang motionless above us, patient the way a predator is patient when it believes its prey has nowhere left to run. "They think this is already decided," Ryan said quietly, standing beside me. I kept my eyes on the display. Let them think that. The countdown continued, hour after hour, steady and calm, exactly as it had been designed to be. I imagined the officers aboard those alien ships, watching our planet in silence, checking their own instruments, seeing nothing but a quiet, uneventful world slowly running out of time to answer. What they could not see was everything we were building in the dark. I thought about the years of secrecy, the sacrifices made by people who would never receive public credit, the quiet, patient work of building a future nobody wanted to admit we might need. I thought about my own choice to spend those years on projects I could never discuss with anyone outside a locked room. I did not know, in that moment, whether we had built enough. I did not know whether patience alone would be enough to change how this ultimatum ended. I only knew that somewhere out past the orbit of the moon, hidden fleets were waking up, engines warming for the first time in years, crews taking their positions in silence. The Kothan had given us 72 hours because every other species before us had needed far less than that to break. They were about to learn how differently that number could be spent. As the final hours of preparation ticked away, I remained at my station, watching the sensor feed, watching the alien fleet hang still and confident above our world. My hand stayed steady on the console, but inside, I felt something sharpen, a mixture of fear and purpose that refused to separate from each other. Somewhere far above me, 12 ships waited for an answer they believed they already knew. They had no idea what was about to fill the sky around them. 60 hours before the deadline, I stood in a hangar I was not supposed to know existed, watching engineers run final checks on a ship that had no official name in any public record. We called it Hidden Line among ourselves, a joke that had turned into a habit years ago and simply stuck. Grace Whitfield found me there, standing quietly near the entrance, her coat still buttoned from the cold outside. She was not part of engineering. She had no reason to be in that hangar, which meant she had come looking specifically for me. "I did not expect to find you buried in machinery," she said, stepping closer. "I did not expect to see you outside a negotiation room," I replied. She allowed herself a small, tired smile. "There is not much to negotiate yet. They are waiting for us to fold. I am simply trying to understand what we are actually capable of before I have to sit across from them and pretend I already know." I gestured toward the ship behind me, its hull dark, its lines sharp, engineers moving around it like it was the most ordinary thing in the world, even though it represented years of secrecy and sacrifice. "This is one of many," I said, "spread across the system, hidden behind the moon, buried in ice on Europa, tucked inside asteroids that look like nothing more than drifting rock from a distance." "How many is many?" she asked. "Enough that if the Kothans scanned every inch of this system with their current sensors, they would still miss most of it," I said. "We built this assuming first contact would go exactly the way it has gone. Confidence from them, silence from us, right up until the moment silence stops being useful." Grace studied the ship for a long moment before speaking again. "And if this fails, if our silence becomes provocation instead of strength, what then?" I did not have a comforting answer for her, so I gave her an honest one instead. "Then we find out how much all of this secrecy was worth." She nodded slowly, absorbing that, and turned to leave without another word, her footsteps steady despite everything. I remained behind, watching the engineers work, thinking about how strange it was that our entire future now depended on decisions made years earlier, in quiet rooms, by people who never expected to see the results in their own lifetime. Back aboard the Meridian, Ryan Cole was reviewing the same sensor logs I had already memorized twice over. The Kathan fleet had not moved. Their formation remained exactly as it had been since their arrival, patient and unbothered, as if time itself belonged to them and not to us. "They are not even bothering to reposition," Ryan said without looking up. "That tells you something about how sure they are. Or how little imagination they have," I replied. He almost laughed, but caught himself, the tension of the moment, too heavy to allow anything close to real humor. I sat down beside him and pulled up a private channel, one used only by senior officers, cleared for the deepest layers of our defense planning. A new message waited for me there, sent directly from General Wright himself. The message was short. "Final positioning begins at hour 50. Full silence discipline until execution. No deviations." I read it twice before closing the channel. 50 hours, I said quietly. Ryan glanced at me. Positioning for what exactly? I could not tell him everything, not because I did not trust him, but because compartmentalization had been drilled into every layer of this operation from the very beginning. Too many minds knowing the full picture meant too many chances for something to slip before it needed to. "You will know when it happens," I said. "Everyone will." He studied me for a long moment, then nodded, understanding without needing an explanation, the same way soldiers had trusted each other, with incomplete information throughout history, whenever the stakes were too high for anything else. The following hours blurred together in a strange, disciplined rhythm. Reports came in from stations across the solar system, each one confirming small, careful movements. A dormant relay station near the asteroid belt powered on for the first time in 3 years. A research vessel that had spent the last decade pretending to study comet composition quietly repositioned itself into a defensive formation nobody outside command had ever rehearsed publicly. I found myself thinking about the people behind each of those movements, engineers and pilots and technicians who had spent years of their lives preparing for a moment they hoped would never come, sacrificing time with their families, sacrificing recognition, sacrificing normal lives, all so that this exact sequence of events could unfold exactly as planned. At hour 40, I received new orders directing me to report to a secondary command post, a heavily shielded structure buried deep beneath the surface of the moon, built specifically to coordinate exactly this kind of operation without any risk of Kothan sensors detecting unusual activity from Earth orbit. The transport ride there was silent. Every person aboard understood the weight of what waited ahead, and none of us wasted words on comfort or small talk. I watched the moon grow larger through the narrow viewport, its surface pale and familiar, hiding secrets beneath its craters that even most of our own people did not know existed. Inside the command post, General Wright stood at the center of a wide room filled with screens, each one displaying a different section of the solar system. Fleet positions blinked steadily across multiple displays, most of them concealed from any outside observer, waiting patiently in the dark, like predators content to let their prey believe it was still alone. "Sullivan," Wright said as I entered, his voice steady despite the pressure clearly weighing on him. "Take position at Station 6. You will help coordinate the emergence sequence when the time comes." "Understood," I said, moving quickly to my assigned console. Grace arrived not long after, escorted by 2 officers, her expression calm, but her eyes carrying the same quiet exhaustion I felt building in myself. She was here now, not as an observer, but as the one who would eventually have to speak for all of us once the moment of silence ended. Hours passed slowly, each one measured carefully against the countdown still displayed prominently on every screen in the room. The Cathan fleet remained motionless above Earth, unaware that an entire system had been quietly rearranging itself around them. At hour 60, new data arrived from a listening post positioned far beyond their detection range. Cathan communication traffic had increased slightly, not because they suspected anything, but because internal discussions had begun about how exactly they intended to divide the resources of a planet they already considered theirs. Ryan Cole, who had been transferred to the same command post an hour earlier, read the translated intercepts over my shoulder, his jaw tightening. "They are already planning distribution schedules," he muttered, "like we are already finished." I kept my eyes on my console, refusing to let anger distract me from precision. "Let them plan," I said. "Plans built on wrong assumptions tend to fall apart the fastest." At hour 68, 4 hours before the deadline, General Wright called the room to full attention. "Final systems check," he said. "Every hidden fleet reports readiness within the next 30 minutes, or reports the reason why not." The room moved with quiet, controlled urgency. Screens updated one after another, confirmations arriving from positions scattered across the solar system, ships that had spent years disguised as harmless research vessels or abandoned mining stations now revealing themselves, at least to us, as something far more serious. I felt my pulse quicken with every confirmation that appeared, not from fear alone anymore, but from something closer to disbelief, watching years of secrecy and sacrifice finally align into a single, coordinated moment. Grace stood near the main display, watching silently, her hands clasped tightly in front of her, the first genuine crack of nervousness I had seen from her since this entire crisis began. At hour 70, with only 2 hours remaining before the Cathan deadline expired, General Wright turned to address the room directly. "They expect silence to break into surrender," he said. "Instead, it is about to break into something they have never encountered before. Every one of you has spent years preparing for this exact moment. Whatever happens next, remember why we chose patience instead of panic." Nobody responded aloud. There was no need. Every person in that room understood exactly what was coming, and exactly how much depended on what happened in the next few hours. I looked at the countdown timer one final time, the numbers falling steadily towards 0, matching the quiet, growing tension building across every hidden position throughout the system. Somewhere far above Earth, 12 Cathan ships continued waiting patiently for an answer they still believed would arrive exactly as it always had before. They had less than 2 hours left to enjoy that certainty. The final minute of the countdown passed in complete silence across the command post. Nobody spoke, nobody moved unless a task required it. I kept my eyes fixed on the main display, watching the timer reach 0, watching the Cathan deadline pass without a single word sent in response. For 3 full seconds, nothing happened at all. Then General Wright gave the order. "Execute emergence sequence," he said, his voice calm but carrying through the entire room like a signal flare. Across the solar system, in places no Cathan sensor had ever mapped, hidden fleets began to move. I watched the tactical display shift in front of me, dozens of new markers appearing almost simultaneously, emerging from behind the moon, rising up from the ice fields of Europa, sliding out from asteroid clusters that had spent years disguised as harmless drifting rock. The sky above Earth, which had held only 12 Kothan ships for days, suddenly filled with hundreds of vessels belonging to the Terran Defense Fleet. I heard Ryan exhale sharply beside me, the sound somewhere between disbelief and relief. "There it is," he whispered. "There it finally is." I did not have time to feel the same disbelief. My console lit up with incoming data, Kothan sensor logs intercepted through channels we had spent years quietly infiltrating. Their confusion arrived almost instantly, confused chatter flooding their communication network, officers demanding explanations from each other, none of them able to answer how an entire fleet had appeared without any warning. "They think it is a trick," Grace said, reading over a translated fragment on a nearby screen. "They think we somehow hid these ships using technology they do not understand." "We did hide them," I said, "using technology we built ourselves." The Kothan command ship, the largest vessel in their formation, began adjusting its position for the first time since arriving in orbit. Its weapons systems activated, a defensive reflex rather than an act of aggression, though the distinction meant very little in that first tense moment. General Wright turned to the communications officer standing near the main console. "Send the response now. Exactly as planned." A tight focused strike targeted only the weapons systems of the Kothan command ship, disabling them without causing damage to the rest of the vessel. It was precise, controlled, and deliberate, a demonstration rather than an attack, proof that we had chosen restraint, not proof that we lacked the strength to do far worse. The Kothan fleet froze in place. I watched their sensor logs light up with confusion turning slowly into alarm. Their command ship, the one meant to project unquestionable authority over every species they encountered, sat disabled and exposed in the middle of a fleet formation that suddenly looked far smaller than it had only minutes earlier. Ryan leaned toward my console, watching the same feed. "They still have 11 ships intact," he said quietly. "This is not over." "I know," I said. "This was never meant to end it. This was meant to change how they saw us." Within minutes, new Kothan communications flooded the intercepted channels, urgent and rapid, voices overlapping each other, in a way that suggested panic rather than coordinated strategy. I listened as translators worked through the chaos, catching fragments of conversation between different Kothan officers, each one arguing a different response. One voice, sharper and more aggressive than the others, demanded immediate retaliation, insisting that any show of weakness would damage the reputation of the entire compact across every world watching this encounter unfold. Another voice, calmer, argued that retaliation against a fleet capable of appearing without warning was reckless, especially without understanding exactly what other capabilities remained hidden. Grace studied the translated exchange carefully, her expression sharpening with focus. "They are already divided," she said. "That crack widens every second they stay silent." General Wright nodded, watching the tactical display without any visible sign of relief. "Hold position," he ordered across every channel. "No further action unless they escalate first." The tension in that command post stretched painfully thin as minutes passed without any Kothan response. Their fleet remained still, disabled command ship drifting slightly out of formation, surrounded now by a much larger presence than they had expected to encounter anywhere near this planet. I kept my attention locked on my console, monitoring every subtle shift in their fleet's positioning, watching for any sign of retaliation or retreat. 10 minutes after the disabling strike, one of the smaller Kothan ships broke formation and began moving toward the edge of the fleet, its engines flaring briefly before stabilizing into a slow, careful drift. "They are pulling back one ship," I reported, "possibly testing our reaction." "Hold," Wright repeated firmly. "Let them make the next move." The smaller ship continued its slow retreat, gradually increasing distance from the rest of the Kothan formation, without making any aggressive maneuvers. It was clear, even without direct communication, that they were testing the boundaries of what had just happened, trying to understand exactly how far our restraint extended. I felt my pulse steady slightly as the minutes stretched onward without further escalation. The initial shock of confrontation was beginning to settle into something more careful, more calculated, both sides now aware that the balance of power in that orbit had shifted dramatically in a matter of seconds. Grace stepped closer to General Wright, her voice low but clear. "This is the moment," she said. "If we wait too long, the silence becomes its own kind of threat. If we speak too soon, we risk looking desperate for their approval." Wright studied her carefully before responding. "What would you suggest?" "We speak now," Grace said. "Not as someone asking permission, as someone stating fact." He considered her words for a long moment before finally nodding. "Open a direct channel," he ordered. "Voice only. No translation software this time. Let them hear exactly how calm we actually are." I adjusted my console, establishing the connection exactly as instructed, my hand steady despite the pressure weighing on the entire room. Grace stepped forward, positioning herself in front of the main communication display, her posture straight, her voice measured and clear when the channel finally opened. "This is Grace Whitfield, representing the government of Earth," she began. "You arrived expecting silence to end in surrender. Instead, silence ended in demonstration. Your command ship remains intact, undamaged beyond the disabling of its weapon systems. This was a choice, not a limitation." There was a long pause before any response arrived, the silence on their end almost as heavy as the tension that had built throughout our own command post over the previous hours. Finally, a voice returned through the channel, translated automatically this time, calm, but noticeably different from the smooth, confident tone that had delivered their original ultimatum days earlier. "We acknowledge your demonstration," the voice said. "We require time to reassess our position." Grace remained perfectly composed. "Take the time you require," she said. "We remain willing to discuss terms that reflect what has just occurred here, rather than terms based on assumptions that no longer apply." The channel closed without further response. I exhaled slowly, realizing only then how tightly I had been holding my breath throughout the entire exchange. Around the room, others reacted similarly, quiet sighs of relief, mixed with lingering tension that refused to fully disappear. Ryan turned to me, his expression somewhere between disbelief and cautious optimism. "Did we just do that?" he asked quietly. "We did," I said, "but this is not finished. This is only the moment they stopped assuming it already was." General Wright studied the tactical display carefully, watching the Cathan fleet remain motionless, their disabled command ship still drifting slightly out of formation, their internal communications still fractured with disagreement. "Maintain full readiness," he ordered across every channel. "This conversation is far from over." I turned back to my console, watching the sky above Earth, now filled with our own fleet standing openly beside theirs for the very first time. The predators who had arrived expecting an easy, familiar surrender now understood, in the clearest way possible, that this particular world had never intended to yield at all. What happened next would depend entirely on how they chose to respond to that realization. 3 hours after the demonstration, a small Cathan shuttle broke away from their fleet and requested permission to approach the meridian directly. I stood beside Ryan on the bridge, watching the shuttle's slow, careful approach, every sensor in the ship tracking its movement with total focus. "They want to talk face to face," Ryan said. "That is new." I kept my eyes on the display. "Or they want to study us up close before deciding whether talking is even worth continuing." General Wright authorized the approach personally, insisting on strict protocols. A single shuttle, unarmed, escorted the moment it entered docking range by 2 of our own fighters positioned close enough to react instantly if anything went wrong. The shuttle docked without incident, and I was assigned, alongside Grace and 2 security officers, to be present when its passenger stepped aboard. The Cathan officer who emerged was tall, with smooth gray skin and sharp, deliberate movements, wearing a uniform far simpler than I expected from a species that had built such an intimidating reputation across so many worlds. His eyes moved carefully across the room, taking in every detail, every officer, every subtle sign of readiness among our crew. He introduced himself through a translator device attached to his collar. His name, as close as our language could render it, was Vec Thal, a senior officer serving directly under the commander of their disabled flagship. Grace stepped forward first, her posture calm but firm. "Thank you for agreeing to speak directly," she said. Vec studied her for a long moment before responding. "My commander did not send me to negotiate," he said. "He sent me to understand. In our experience, species facing an ultimatum from the Compact either submit quickly or resist chaotically, without coordination, without discipline. What happened 3 hours ago matched neither pattern." I stepped closer, unable to hold back the question forming in my mind. "How many species have resisted before us?" I asked. Vec turned his attention toward me, his expression unreadable behind features so different from our own that reading emotion required careful attention. "3," he said. "All 3 were destroyed within days, their resistance scattered and disorganized. None of them managed anything close to what your fleet accomplished within hours of our arrival." The room fell quiet at that answer, the weight of those words settling heavily across everyone present. Grace broke the silence carefully. "Then perhaps it is time your compact learned that assumptions built from 3 examples do not apply universally." Vec considered her words for a long moment before responding. "That is precisely what my commander fears," he said. "Not your fleet alone. The possibility that other species watching this encounter unfold might begin questioning assumptions your species has just proven wrong." I exchanged a glance with Ryan, both of us understanding immediately what that statement truly meant. This was never just about Earth. Every species already under Cathan control, every planet watching quietly from a distance, would learn exactly what happened here, and that knowledge alone could shift power dynamics across their entire compact. Grace continued the conversation carefully, guiding it toward practical terms rather than lingering on the broader implications neither side wanted to fully address yet. "What does your commander propose moving forward?" she asked. Vec hesitated before answering. "He proposes formal negotiation, terms discussed as equals, rather than terms dictated from a position of assumed authority." "That is acceptable," Grace said, "but understand this clearly. Any attempt to use these negotiations as a delay tactic while gathering reinforcement will be treated as an act of aggression, and our response will not be limited to disabling weapons systems a second time." Vec studied her carefully, something shifting subtly in his expression, something that, translated loosely into human terms, resembled cautious respect. "I will relay that message exactly as spoken," he said. The meeting ended shortly after, Vec returning to his shuttle under the same careful escort that had brought him aboard. I watched the small vessel depart, rejoining the Cathan formation still hovering above Earth, their disabled command ship slowly being repaired by their own engineering teams under constant observation from our sensors. Later that evening, General Wright called a smaller meeting, limited to only a handful of senior officers, myself included. The mood in the room was different now, less about survival and more about strategy, about how exactly to navigate the delicate balance between demonstrating strength and avoiding unnecessary escalation. "They want formal negotiation," Wright said, summarizing the encounter for those who had not been present. "That is progress, but it does not mean the danger has passed." "What about the officer who wanted immediate retaliation?" someone asked from across the table. "The one we intercepted arguing against restraint." Wright's expression tightened slightly. "That officer, identified in later intercepts as Commander Doth, continues pushing for aggressive action within their own command structure. He has not been silenced by this development. If anything, our restraint may be feeding his argument that we intend to use negotiation as a delay tactic of our own." Grace, seated near the head of the table, spoke carefully. "Then we make sure our actions during negotiation directly contradict that argument. Every gesture from this point forward needs to demonstrate patience and consistency, not hesitation. I found myself thinking about Vec Thal's words from earlier, about the fear rippling quietly through the Cathan Compact now that one species had refused to follow the pattern every other encounter had established. That fear could work in our favor, or it could push officers like Doth toward reckless decisions born from desperation rather than calculation. Over the following 2 days, formal negotiations began aboard a neutral platform positioned carefully between our fleet and theirs, monitored constantly by both sides to ensure neither party attempted anything unexpected. Grace led our delegation personally, supported by a small team of advisors, myself included, given my direct role in coordinating the fleet's emergence. The Cathan delegation was led by their fleet commander himself, a figure whose presence carried an unmistakable weight of authority despite the disabled ship serving as evidence of how quickly that authority had been challenged. The early sessions moved slowly, careful and measured, both sides testing boundaries through language rather than weapons. The Cathan commander pressed repeatedly on questions of resource allocation and territorial boundaries, testing whether our earlier demonstration had been a singular event or represented sustained capability across broader engagements. Grace answered each question with calm, measured honesty, neither exaggerating our capabilities nor allowing any hint of uncertainty to creep into her responses. During a brief recess on the 3rd day of negotiations, I found myself standing near a viewport alongside Vec Thal, both of us watching the quiet, careful movement of ships positioned outside. "You seem less guarded than you did during our first meeting," I observed. Vec considered this before responding. "Fear tends to soften once it becomes clear that destruction is not the immediate intention of the other party," he said. "Your species demonstrated strength without demonstrating cruelty. That distinction matters more than you may realize." I studied him carefully, curious, despite the tension still surrounding everything happening around us. "Does your compact typically show cruelty toward species who resist?" I asked. Vec's expression shifted slightly, something close to discomfort passing briefly across his features. "The examples I mentioned earlier were not simply defeated," he said quietly. "They were made examples of, deliberately, to discourage future resistance from any other species observing the outcome." The weight of that statement settled heavily in my chest. "We chose differently," I said. "Not because we lacked the ability to escalate further, but because we understood the difference between strength and destruction." Vec remained quiet for a long moment before responding. "That distinction is precisely what troubles Commander Doth and those who share his views," he said. "A species capable of overwhelming force who chooses restraint instead challenges the entire foundation upon which the Compact's authority has been built." Before I could respond further, an alert sounded through the platform, drawing both our attention immediately toward the main display. A small group of Cathan fighters, unauthorized and moving without official clearance from their fleet command, had broken formation and were accelerating directly toward our position. Vec's expression shifted instantly from cautious calm to visible alarm. "That is Doth," he said. "He is acting without authorization." I moved quickly toward the communication station, alerting our own fleet command immediately, while Grace and the Cathan commander were pulled from their negotiation session to address the sudden escalation. General Wright's voice came through moments later, steady despite the urgency of the situation. "Hold position," he ordered. "Do not fire unless directly engaged. Let their own command handle this internally if possible." The Cathan fleet commander, visibly furious, issued rapid orders through his own communication channel, demanding Doth stand down immediately. For several tense seconds it remained unclear whether those orders would be obeyed. Then, gradually, the unauthorized fighters began slowing their approach, eventually turning back toward the main Cathan formation under clear direction from their own commander rather than any action from our side. Grace exhaled slowly beside me, tension easing only slightly from her shoulders. "That could have ended very differently," she said quietly. "It could have," I agreed, "but it did not, because they chose to control their own escalation rather than allow it to spiral further." The negotiation session resumed shortly after, though the atmosphere had shifted noticeably, both sides now acutely aware of exactly how fragile this fragile peace truly remained. Vec approached me quietly before returning to his own delegation. "Doth will face consequences for this," he said, "but understand that his views are shared by others within our compact who have not yet acted so visibly. This negotiation matters more than either side may fully realize." I nodded, understanding the weight of his words completely. "Then let us make sure it succeeds," I said, "because I doubt either of us wants to discover what happens if it fails." Negotiations continued for another 5 days following the incident with Commander Doth, each session slower and more deliberate than the last, both delegations weighing every word carefully, aware that a single misstep could unravel everything that had been carefully built since the moment our fleet first emerged. I spent most of those days moving between the negotiation platform and the Meridian, coordinating fleet readiness, while Grace worked tirelessly to shape terms that reflected the new reality both sides now understood clearly. Earth would not become a tributary world. Earth would not surrender its resources or its military under Cothan command. Instead, the terms being discussed centered around something neither side had ever formally established before within the Compact's long history of expansion: equal standing. On the 6th day, General Wright called me into a private briefing alongside Grace, his expression carrying a rare hint of cautious optimism. "The Cothan fleet commander has agreed to bring formal terms back to the wider Compact leadership," he said. "Terms recognizing Earth as an independent, sovereign power, eligible for trade and diplomatic relations, but explicitly excluded from tributary status or resource extraction agreements." "That is remarkable," I said, still processing the weight of what that meant after everything we had endured over the previous week. "It is a beginning," Grace corrected gently. "The wider Compact leadership still needs to approve these terms. Commander Doth and those who share his views have not disappeared simply because one confrontation ended without further violence." Wright nodded in agreement. "This is not the end of tension between us and the Compact," he said, "but it is proof that our approach, patience combined with decisive strength when necessary, created an outcome nobody expected when this crisis began." Over the following weeks, formal communication channels opened gradually between Earth and the wider Cothan Compact leadership, each exchange carefully monitored, each term debated extensively before final approval. I remained involved throughout much of that process, coordinating fleet security, while diplomatic teams worked through the complicated details of establishing an entirely new kind of relationship between our world and a coalition that had never previously negotiated as equals with anyone. Vec Thal remained a consistent presence throughout those negotiations, gradually becoming less a representative of an opposing force and more something closer to a colleague navigating unfamiliar territory alongside us. During one of our final formal sessions, he approached me privately during a break, his expression thoughtful in a way I had come to recognize over the weeks we had worked alongside each other. "You surprised us in ways that will be studied for a very long time," he said, "not simply through strength, but through choosing carefully when and how to demonstrate it." I considered his words carefully before responding. "We spent years preparing for a moment we hoped would never come," I said. "That preparation shaped how we responded once it finally arrived." Vec nodded slowly. "Perhaps other species within the Compact will begin asking similar questions now," he said. "Whether resistance built on patience rather than chaos might change outcomes they previously believed impossible." That thought lingered with me long after that conversation ended, the understanding that our actions had rippled far beyond simply securing Earth's own independence, potentially reshaping how an entire coalition of species understood the balance between strength and restraint moving forward. 2 months after the initial confrontation, formal terms were finally signed, establishing Earth's independent status recognized clearly by the Cothan Compact leadership. Commander Doth, I later learned, had been quietly removed from active command following the unauthorized incident during negotiations, his aggressive stance ultimately weakening rather than strengthening the argument he had hoped to make. I stood on the observation deck of the Meridian on the day the formal ceremony took place, watching through the wide viewport as the Cathan fleet, now reduced from 12 ships to a smaller diplomatic presence, prepared to depart Earth's orbit for the first time since their arrival. Grace joined me there, her expression carrying the exhaustion of months spent navigating one of the most delicate diplomatic challenges humanity had ever faced. "It still feels strange," she said quietly, watching them leave peacefully after everything that almost happened. I kept my eyes on the departing fleet. "We built this outcome carefully," I said. "Years of preparation, difficult choices, and enough restraint to avoid unnecessary destruction. That combination mattered more than raw strength alone ever could have." Ryan Cole joined us shortly after, watching the same scene unfold with quiet satisfaction. "Word is already spreading beyond their immediate fleet," he said. "Other worlds within their compact are hearing about what happened here. Some are reportedly asking similar questions about their own arrangements with the Cathan leadership." "That does not surprise me," Grace said. "Precedent matters enormously in situations like this. We proved something that challenges assumptions this compact has relied upon for a very long time." I thought back to my conversation with Vec weeks earlier. His words about other species potentially reconsidering their own circumstances now that Earth had proven resistance built on patience and precision could succeed where previous chaotic attempts had failed completely. Months later, as trade agreements slowly began forming between Earth and several worlds previously unfamiliar to us, Vec Thal returned briefly aboard a small diplomatic shuttle, this time not as a representative negotiating tense terms, but as an official liaison helping establish smoother communication between our two very different cultures. He found me on the observation deck once again, watching a shuttle prepare for departure toward one of the newly established trade routes now opening slowly between our worlds. "Your species continues surprising us," he said, standing beside me. "Not through aggression, but through consistency. That quality is rare among those we have previously encountered." I allowed myself a small, genuine smile, something I had not felt fully capable of since this entire crisis first began months earlier. "We simply refuse to be defined by assumptions built from encounters that had nothing to do with who we actually are," I said. Vec considered this for a long moment before responding. "Perhaps that lesson extends further than either of us initially realized," he said quietly. I stood there for a while after he departed, watching Earth slowly rotate below us, its surface calm and unaware of just how close everything had come to unfolding very differently months earlier. I thought about the years of quiet sacrifice that had made this outcome possible, the engineers and pilots and officers who spent their lives preparing for a moment they desperately hoped would never actually arrive. I thought about General Wright's steady leadership throughout every tense decision, about Grace's careful diplomacy that transformed potential disaster into genuine opportunity, about Ryan's quiet loyalty throughout every uncertain hour we spent together during those critical days. Most of all, I thought about the moment the sky above Earth had filled unexpectedly with warships nobody outside a small circle had known existed, transforming an ultimatum built on assumed weakness into a demonstration of exactly how wrong those assumptions truly were. The Cathan Compact had expected humanity to yield quietly, exactly as every other species before us had done. Instead, they encountered a world that had spent years quietly preparing for precisely this moment, choosing patience over panic, precision over chaos, and ultimately proving that strength measured through restraint could accomplish far more than strength measured through destruction ever could. As I watched Earth continue its slow, steady rotation beneath the ship, I understood clearly that this was not truly an ending at all, but the careful, deliberate beginning of humanity's place among the wider community of worlds, now watching closely to see exactly what we would choose to become next.